It's February 16th, 1659, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Until about 10 years ago, if you wanted to call for a bill in a restaurant, you had to make the universal check please hand signal, which was a faintly embarrassing little mime of scribbling an imaginary check in the air, which is now obviously completely antiquated, just like the financial instrument that inspired it. But today in history, in 1659, when a merchant signed one of the earliest non-modern British checks, cutting a check couldn't have seemed any more cutting edge.
Yeah, it was written for the sum of £400 by a merchant called Nicholas Vanacker. And I've got to say, the dude was an early adopter.
He liked a check.
Yeah, if you think of the amount of things that survive on paper from that era, what a small percentage they must be. We have another check for £200 signed by him the following year, and one that actually possibly predates this one for a comparatively paltry £10.
What a baller, by the way, signing over like £400, £200. This is like...
Yeah, £416.59, yeah.
The point of checks was to satisfy your high roller clients, and it was really more about the bankers or goldsmiths retaining the people they wanted on their account list. And so, regardless of the fact that it happens to be the same bloke who signed a couple of these checks, the point is it's the same bankers on almost all of them. Like in the history of the modern check, it's always Morris and Clayton. They were bankers in London, and they wanted the best list of the poshest people with the most disposable income. And they were offering innovations in the way that online banks would now. Like, this is convenient. I mean, and ultimately that is what all banking innovation comes from, isn't it? Like, how can we streamline this to maximize our profit and minimize risk? This is convenient because we don't have to open the safe to get the gold bullion out for this guy. It's just a piece of paper he's going to sign, then we give it to someone else. That's minimal cost for us. We can guise it up as convenience for him. Bingo.
Yeah, and Morris and Clayton were behind a number of big financial innovations that we know today, because they were also the first bankers to use the mortgage as a long-term security for loans. They were then the largest lender to landowners in England for 40 years, especially for the dominant Whig aristocracy of the time.
Yeah, they could be found on Cornhill in the City of London at the sign of the Flying Horse.
Sorry, that sounds like a Doctor Who thing. What do you mean, at the sign of the Flying Horse?
You're walking down the street, you can't read.
Yeah.
You just look for the sign of the Flying Horse, like a pub sign. There was a man called Abraham Fowler who was operating as a banker on Fleet Street at the sign of the Three Squirrels. This was common practice. And bankers, especially Morris and Clayton, but banks generally, were doing very big business at this time because of the demand for credit in the years following the English Civil War. Lots of royalist aristocrats had to pay big fines to get confiscated land or property back, and they needed loans in order to do that. And actually, Nicholas Vanacker himself seems to have benefited from this upheaval, because a few years after the Civil War, he purchased the manor house in Erith in Kent, which had previously belonged to a former royalist commander. So he was making bank off of this too. And I was thinking, what did these banks do to pay out all of these checks and keep track of them?
Yeah.
It turns out that until the late 1700s, clerks from each bank would physically go round all the other banks to exchange the checks and tot up the differences and settle up the balance between them. In the 1770s, they eventually decided to all meet together in one place. This was, what a professional era, the Five Bells pub in Lombard Street.
Well, you might as well. End of the day, knocking off and just settling up loads and loads of money.
It's not like you're sitting there with anything valuable, just a list of IOUs from the richest men in the country. Let's go for a pint. But I suppose the fact that Britain is the kind of country and the kind of culture that would formalise a process like this, albeit in that seemingly informal way, is why it ended up being Britain in the 1700s that did sort of invent the modern check, partly because of the Civil War background and because of the empire as well. So there was a lot of international trading, and checks came out of international trading, but also because of our respected courts and our respect for law and order, because the success of checks had to rely on legal recognition ultimately and enforcement ultimately. There needed to be clear laws around debt and repayment and fraud prevention before it would become a truly trusted financial instrument, and Britain would be a good place to try this technology out. Yeah. But for centuries, people had been dabbling around with the idea of IOUs.
Yeah, exactly. The use of something like checks dates back to ancient times, actually. In India during the Maurya Empire, which was 321 to 185 BC, a commercial instrument known as the adesha was used, and it was very similar to checks. Similarly, the Romans are believed to have employed an early form of checks called prescriptions as early as the 1st century BC. By the 3rd century AD, Persian banks began using letters known as a cheque, meaning document or contract, which kind of flies in the face of one of the etymological derivations for the word check.
Yeah, I didn't like this either. I know where you're going.
Yeah.
Because I'd been told that check came from the old French word for which was exchequer, meaning to check or control. It had come from the medieval Latin term of scacacrium, meaning chessboard, or exchequer, referring to the table used for accounting and record keeping, often marked with a grid resembling a chessboard. And there was this association with checking the king and all of that in this description. And it just goes to show what a rubbish science etymology is, that then this Persian word shows up that is very much like the word that we use for checks today.
Yeah, I didn't like this one bit. I was like, oh, so Persians were using this thing like a check and they called it a shack. Okay, I think that's case closed. But then it's like, no, it ultimately derives from the Persian word shah, meaning king, which is eventually where we get the English word chess via the French. And from here, it's the sense of check as in checks and balances, meaning like measures you put in place to prevent errors or abuse. And check did this to money by... Yeah, no.
On American banking blogs now, some of them say... the word check even comes from people having to check the validity of the information on the check. I was like, no, it doesn't. That's just because you spell it wrong.
Probably not, yeah.
Well, actually, I should say at this point, for UK listeners, on this day, Nicholas Vanacker was unfortunately writing a check with a K. That was original spelling. The Frenchified QUE did not become the default British spelling until the 19th century. But if it makes you feel better, he was not calling it a check. Nobody was calling it a check. That word is not attested for another 50 years or so after this day. He would have been calling it a drawn note because it was a note with which you could draw on a bank.
Anyway, the whole point of this was that you didn't have to lug around large amounts of silver or gold across a continent to be able to exchange it. And that was transformative. And the technology grew in the standards of the 1700s pretty quickly then. First, you got checks printed with the name of the issuing bank on. That happened as early as the mid-1700s. Then there were designs on the check to prevent counterfeiting. All of this before the 19th century. In 1830, checkbooks were first introduced in the forms of 50, 100 and 200 by the Bank of England. And then by the mid-20th century, you get the MICR, which is the magnetic ink character recognition. That's basically the computer automation. So that's how a computer reading a check knows what it is without having to actually read it.
Exactly. And all of that is like the efforts of banks to try to find ways to turn something that is a little bit like an IOU written on a piece of paper into something more formal that can definitely not be forged. There's this constant ongoing battle between forgers and banks in particular trying to keep ahead of one another to make checks continue to be valid. And actually, there was also an effort as late as 1931 to try to standardize checks internationally. It was the Geneva Convention on the Unification of the Law Relating to Checks. But many European and South American states, as well as Japan, did join the convention, but a bunch of holdouts, including the US and members of the British Commonwealth, didn't participate. And so it remained really, really difficult, even into the 20th century, for checks to be used across country borders. And so it's like this sort of useful technology, but it never really totally managed to be standardized.
Yeah. Still, I mean, like, because I've got an American bank account because some sponsors on some of my shows pay in dollars. And if you've had this experience of suddenly when you're banking with an American bank account, it'll ask you, is it checking or savings?
Yeah.
When you're trying to pay something and you're like, I don't know what that means. I'll tick checking, I guess, because I'm not earning interest on it. And like just the idea that like, so in Britain, we call that a current account. That's the one that your check's associated with. In America, the whole basis of the account is so that you can pay a check. That's the whole terminology of it. And that's not been standardized either.
It doesn't matter anymore, guys, because checks, I don't know if you've noticed this, have lost some of their cultural relevance in recent years. 1990 was the peak of the check, at least in the UK, when 4 billion checks were made out, which that means everyone was making out like 20 checks each, including children, per year. I mean,
well, imagine what it would be now, though, if you could only pay on Amazon with check like you could in the early days of eBay. Like, how many checks would that be a day?
I mean, I remember writing checks for my driving lessons.
When you write a check, do you write the word only at the end?
Yes, my mum always told me to put
and
only.
then you have to cross
then double cross.
Yeah.
I just, it feels like a humble brag to me. You know?
Yeah.
I pay the
but I've got more.
Yeah, exactly. £85 only. I mean, it's only £85, whatever.
Now,
this episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/retrospectors